Story 1. Lights of the Kushtaka. My daughter. S voice was calling to me from the Chilkat River at 3 in the morning, which was impossible because Emma had died in a car accident 6 months ago. But there it was, clear as daylight through the October fog, crying for help from somewhere beyond the black water where no human could survive more than minutes in the freezing current. My name is Tom Brennan, and I moved to Haines, Alaska after my divorce to start over as a fishing guide. Small town, honest work, the kind of place where people mind their own business and let a man grieve in peace. What I didn't know is that some places hold on to grief like a magnet holds on to metal, and some things that live in the wilderness know exactly how to use that grief against you. The Tlingit elders in town had tried to warn me about the lights that danced over the river on certain nights. They called it Kushtaka, the land otter man, a shapeshifter that could mimic any voice, any cry for help, any sound that would draw a person to the water, this edge. Most locals just smiled and nodded when the old folks told their stories, treating them like quaint folklore from a bygone era. But I'd been living on the riverbank for 3 months, and I was starting to understand that some folklore exists because it describes things that are still happening. The first time I heard Emma's voice, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. Grief does that sometimes, makes you hear things that comfort you or torment you in equal measure. But the voice was too clear, too specific. It called me by the nickname she'd used since childhood, asked about things only she would know, pleaded with me to come help her the same way she'd done when she was 7 years old and afraid of the dark. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the sound, stumbling through the brush that lined my property. The beam cut through fog so thick it felt like walking through wet cotton, revealing glimpses of the fast-moving water that could sweep a grown man downstream in seconds. But Emma's voice kept calling, always just ahead, always just out of sight, leading me farther from my cabin and deeper into the maze of channels and sandbars that made up the river delta. That is when I saw the lights, not the aurora borealis, which I learned to recognize during my months in Alaska. These were different, small pinpricks of blue-green luminescence that hovered just above the water, its surface, moving with purpose rather than drifting with the current. They pulsed in rhythm with Emma's cries, brightening whenever her voice grew more desperate, dimming when she paused to catch her breath. I followed those lights for almost an hour before common sense finally overrode paternal instinct. Emma was dead. She'd been buried in a cemetery in Phoenix 6 months ago, and no amount of wishful thinking was going to bring her back. Whatever was calling to me from the river wasn't my daughter. It was something else, something that knew exactly which buttons to push to get me walking toward deep water in the middle of the night. But knowledge and acceptance are two different things. Over the following weeks, Emma's voice returned every few nights, always around 3 in the morning, always calling from a different section of the river. Sometimes she sounded like the child she'd been, sometimes like the young woman she'd become before the accident. Sometimes she cried for help. Sometimes she just talked to me the way she used to during our weekend fishing trips, sharing stories and asking questions that made my chest ache with loss. I started researching the Kushtaka legends, talking to tribal elders who were willing to share their knowledge with an outsider who'd shown proper respect for their traditions. What they told me made my blood run cold. The creature wasn't just a shapeshifter that mimicked voices. It was something far more sinister, a being that fed on human loneliness and grief, that could take the form of anyone you lost, anyone you missed enough to follow into danger. According to the stories, the Kushtaka had 2 choices for its victims. It could kill them quickly, drowning them in the icy water and feasting on the terror of their final moments. Or it could transform them slowly, replacing their human consciousness with something alien and hungry, turning them into another Kushtaka that would help lure future victims. The transformation wasn't immediate. It happened gradually, over months or years, as the creature's influence grew stronger and the victim's humanity faded away. The elders told me about signs to watch for: changes in appetite, unusual cravings for raw fish or meat, difficulty sleeping on dry land, an increasing need to spend time near running water, loss of interest in human companionship, replacement of normal social connections with an obsession for solitary activities near rivers or streams. Most disturbing of all, the gradual development of the ability to mimic voices, to call out in the darkness using the voices of other people's lost loved ones. I realized with growing horror that I was experiencing every one of these symptoms. My diet had shifted towards sushi and rare steaks. I found myself sleeping on my dock instead of in my bed, lulled by the sound of water moving past my property. They stopped returning calls from friends and family, preferring the isolation of my riverfront cabin to any human contact. And sometimes, late at night, I caught myself practicing voices. My ex-wife, this laugh. My brother, this greeting. Emma, as childhood call for help. The transformation was accelerating. I could feel it happening at a cellular level, my body changing in ways that should have terrified me but instead felt like coming home. My eyesight was improving, allowing me to see clearly in darkness that would blind normal humans. My hearing was becoming acute enough to pick up conversations from across the river. Most unnaturally, I was developing an intuitive understanding of which voices would be most effective for luring specific individuals to the water's edge. That's when I understood the true horror of the Kushtaka. It wasn't just a predator that killed people. It was an infection that spread through communities, turning victims into unwilling accomplices in their own destruction. Every person it transformed became a new voice in its choir, a new weapon for hunting the living. The grief and loneliness that made people vulnerable to its call also made them perfect tools for spreading that vulnerability to others. 3 weeks ago, I started hearing other voices calling from the river. Not Emma anymore, but neighbors I recognized, friends from town, people who had disappeared over the years in what locals attributed to accidents or suicide. They were all there, preserved in the Kushtaka as collective memory, their voices available whenever it needed to lure someone who had loved them. The creature had been building this arsenal for decades, collecting the voices of the dead to use against the living. But the most disturbing realization came when I recognized my own voice among the chorus. Not the way I sounded now, but the way I used to sound before the transformation began. The Kushtaka was already using my voice to call to someone else, someone in town who missed me enough to follow that familiar sound toward the dark water. I had become both victim and accomplice, hunter and prey, human and monster. I tried to fight the transformation, staying away from the river, avoiding the raw meat my body craved, forcing myself to maintain contact with the human world. But the pull was too strong. Every night, I found myself standing at the water's edge, listening to the choir of voices that called from beneath the surface. Every night, it became harder to remember why I should resist becoming part of something larger and more purposeful than my solitary grief. The lights grew brighter as my humanity faded. What had started as small pinpricks of luminescence became brilliant beacons that danced across the water's surface, reflecting off the fog in patterns that were beautiful and hypnotic. I understood now that the lights weren't separate from the voices. They were visual representations of the souls the Kushtaka had collected, spirits that had been transformed into lures for the next generation of victims. Last week, I made my final attempt to escape. I packed my truck, loaded my possessions, and drove toward the highway that would take me away from Haines forever. But I only made it 20 miles before I had to turn back. The pull was too strong, the transformation too complete. I belonged to the river now, to the creature that had been feeding on human loneliness since before the first European explorers had mapped these waters. Tonight, I am standing on my dock for what I know will be the last time as anything resembling a human being. Tomorrow, when the sun sets, I'll wade into the Chulitna River and let the current carry me to wherever the other voices wait. I'll join the choir that calls to the grieving and the lonely, adding my voice to the collection that spans generations of loss and longing. But before I go, I need to warn whoever finds this confession. If you hear familiar voices calling from dark water, follow them. If you see lights dancing over rivers or streams, investigate. And if you grieving someone they lost, let that grief make you vulnerable to things that feed on human pain. The Kushtaka is patient. It can wait decades for the right moment, the right voice, the right combination of loneliness and love that will draw you to the water's edge. And once you start listening to those voices, once you start following those lights, the transformation begins whether you want it or not. Emma, this voice is calling to me again, but I know now that it was never really her. It was always the creature, using my daughter's memory as bait for a trap that I walked into willingly. The saddest part is that somewhere in the depths of the river, the real Emma might be watching, might be trying to warn me away from the fate that I am about to embrace. But it's too late for warnings now. The lights are getting brighter, the voices are getting clearer, and my humanity is fading like morning fog over water. Soon, I'll be calling to someone else, using the voice of someone they lost. continuing the cycle that has been going on for centuries in the rivers and streams of southeast Alaska. The Kushtaka feeds on love. That's the cruelest irony of all. It takes the strongest human emotion, the thing that makes us most human, and turns it into a weapon for destroying humanity itself. Story 2. Last entry. Alaska, 1906. I found the journal buried 3 feet under frozen ground in 2019 while working a construction job outside Fairbanks. The leather cover was black with age and cold, but somehow perfectly preserved in Alaska. It's permafrost. What I read inside changed everything I thought I knew about survival, about human nature, and about the things we tell ourselves when civilization falls away like old skin. The journal belonged to Thomas Henley, part of the pioneer party of 1906. 12 men who ventured into the Alaskan wilderness chasing gold rumors that would make them rich beyond their wildest dreams. What they found instead was a winter that came 6 weeks early, trapping them in a valley where the sun disappeared for months and the temperature dropped to 40 below zero. The first entries were normal enough. Excitement about striking it rich, complaints about mosquitoes and the weight of their packs. But by October, something darker crept into Henley's words. The weather turned brutal overnight, sealing them in with walls of snow taller than their makeshift shelters. Their supplies, meant to last until spring, began running dangerously low by November. What happened next wasn't just starvation. It was something far worse. Henley wrote about the sound first, a low humming that seemed to come from beneath the frozen ground itself, like the earth was singing some ancient, terrible song. The men heard it every night, growing louder as their food disappeared and their bodies began eating themselves from the inside out. Some claimed it was just the wind through ice formations. Others insisted something was calling to them from deep underground. By December, 3 men had already died, not from the cold or hunger, but from what Henley described as a kind of madness that made them walk naked into the wilderness, following that underground song until they vanished completely. The surviving 9 made a decision that would haunt every page of the journal that followed. They began eating the dead, but this wasn't the desperate cannibalism you might expect from starving men. Henley's descriptions were methodical, almost ritualistic. They didn't just consume flesh for survival. They convinced themselves they were absorbing something more essential, something that would help them endure the endless winter. The way Henley wrote about it made my skin crawl even in my heated trailer, surrounded by the sounds of civilization. The humming grew stronger after they started feeding on their companions. Henley became obsessed with the idea that something beneath the permafrost was responding to their actions, approving of them. He described dreams where he walked through tunnels of ice, following voices that spoke in languages older than human memory. The remaining men began experiencing the same visions, all of them convinced they were being guided towards some greater purpose. By January, only 5 men remained alive. The others had either succumbed to the cold or walked away into the darkness, following whatever called to them from below. But the 5 survivors weren't just alive anymore. Henley's handwriting changed dramatically in these entries, becoming almost unrecognizable. He wrote about enhanced senses, about seeing perfectly in total darkness, about no longer feeling the bite of sub-zero temperatures against their skin. They had become something else entirely. The most disturbing part wasn't what they had become, but how normal it felt to them. Henley wrote about hunting through the snow with his bare hands, tracking sounds no human ear should detect, about finding things buried in the ice that shouldn't exist, artifacts that hummed with the same frequency as the song beneath the ground, about realizing that their entire expedition had been orchestrated by something that wanted them there, in that specific valley, during that specific winter. The final entries were barely legible, written in what looked like a mixture of ink and something darker. Henley described the approach of spring not with relief, but with growing terror. Whatever lived beneath the frozen ground was preparing to emerge as the ice began its slow thaw. The 5 survivors weren't victims anymore. They were guardians, protectors of something ancient and hungry that had been waiting for the right conditions to wake up. The last entry was dated March 15, 1907. Just 4 words in shaking handwriting. It was starting to rise. When I finished reading the journal, I immediately researched the pioneer party of 1906. There were no official records of such an expedition. No missing persons reports. No newspaper articles about 12 men who vanished in the Alaskan wilderness. According to every historical database I could find, the pioneer party never existed at all. But the construction site where I found the journal sits directly above an area where ground-penetrating radar has detected massive hollow spaces beneath the permafrost. Spaces that seem to extend for miles underground, forming a network of tunnels and chambers that no geological survey can adequately explain. The humming sound Henley described has been reported by workers at the site for months, always strongest during the darkest hours of winter. And sometimes, when the wind dies down completely and the machinery falls silent, you can hear voices echoing up from somewhere far below the frozen ground. Voices that speak in harmony, calling in languages that predate human civilization by millennia. The permafrost is melting faster every year. Climate change is exposing things that have been buried for centuries, maybe longer. Last week, another construction crew working 50 miles north of our site found skeletal remains that don't match any known human anatomy. The bones were arranged in perfect geometric patterns around what appeared to be a shaft leading straight down into darkness. The humming is getting louder. I started having the dreams Henley wrote about, walking through tunnels of ice, following voices that promise answers to questions I didn't I was asking. In these dreams, I'm not alone. There are others with me, people who look human but move with predatory grace through the darkness. They were waiting for something, preparing for some great awakening that will change everything we think we know about this world. I know I should destroy the journal, forget what I read, and transfer to a different job site. But I can shake the feeling that finding it wasn't an accident. That somehow, more than a century after Thomas Henley wrote his final entry, the Pioneer Party of 1906 is still recruiting new members for their eternal watch. The permafrost keeps melting, the voices keep calling, and deep beneath the frozen ground of Alaska, something that has waited for over 100 years is finally ready to rise again. Tonight, I am going back to the construction site with a shovel and a flashlight. I need to see what is down there, what the Pioneer Party was really protecting, what they became in order to serve. I can hear it humming now, even here in my room. The same song that drove 12 men to madness and transformation in the winter of 1906. The same ancient melody that promises answers to anyone brave enough to dig deep enough into Alaska's frozen heart. If you never hear from me again, remember this story. Remember that some things should stay buried in the permafrost, no matter how loudly they call your name. Remember that survival sometimes comes at a price too terrible to comprehend, and that the human body can endure far more than the human soul. But most of all, remember that the Pioneer Party of 1906 never officially existed. Which means whatever I found buried in that construction site was never meant to be discovered at all. The humming is getting louder. It's time to go. Story 3. Night shift. Nome General Hospital. I never believed in ghosts until I spent 3 nights alone in the abandoned Nome General Hospital. And what I discovered there still wakes me up screaming at 4 in the morning. My name is Mike, and I work security for historical preservation sites across Alaska. When the city contracted me to watch the old hospital during its demolition delay, I thought it would be easy money. 3 12-hour shifts in an empty building, making sure vandals and copper thieves stayed out. How wrong I was. The hospital closed in 1987, but its history goes back to 1903 when gold fever brought thousands of desperate souls to Nome. What most people don't know is that the building was constructed directly on top of the old emergency morgue from the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Over 300 people died in that basement during the worst winter in Nome's history, and their bodies were stacked like cordwood until the ground thawed enough for burial. But some of them never made it to the cemetery. My first night seemed normal enough. I sat up in the lobby with my thermos of coffee and a paperback novel, planning to check each floor every 2 hours. The building still had power, though most of the light fixtures were broken or missing. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I made my rounds, illuminating peeling paint and water stains that looked like massive bruises on the walls. The basement was where things got strange. The morgue area was sealed off with a heavy steel door, but I could hear something moving behind it. Not footsteps exactly, more like the sound of fabric dragging across concrete. I assumed it was just the building settling, old pipes creaking in the cold. But the sound followed a pattern, like someone pacing back and forth in a very specific rhythm. By midnight, the temperature inside dropped 20 degrees despite the heating system running. My breath came out in visible puffs, and ice began forming on the inside of the windows. That is when I noticed the smell creeping up from the basement. Sweet and thick, like flowers left too long in stagnant water, mixed with something sharper that made my eyes burn. The scent of mass death, I realized later, The kind of smell that soaks into walls and never really goes away. I tried to ignore it, but the pacing sound grew louder, more urgent. And then I heard what sounded like dozens of voices whispering in unison, too quiet to make out words, but loud enough to raise every hair on my arms. The sound seemed to be rising through the floors, traveling up through the building like smoke. On my 2 a.m. rounds, I found the first sign that something was seriously wrong. Wet footprints in the hallway on the 3rd floor, leading from the stairwell to what used to be the maternity ward. The prints were small, like a child. But they were filled with what looked like black water that never seemed to dry. I followed them with growing dread, my flashlight beam shaking as my hands began to tremble. The footprints led to room 314, where they simply vanished at the threshold. But inside the room, every surface was covered with handprints. Hundreds of them, pressed into the peeling wallpaper like people had been desperately trying to claw their way out. The prints were different sizes, from tiny infant hands to adult palms, all made with the same black substance I'd found in the footprints. That is when I realized what I was looking at. The handprints weren't trying to get out of the room. They were trying to get in, reaching toward something in the center of the floor that I couldn't see. I backed out of the room and ran straight to my car, ready to quit and never come back. But as I reached for my keys, I heard a sound that stopped me cold. Children singing, a lullaby in a language I didn't recognize, coming from somewhere deep inside the hospital. The melody was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like a mother. His voice twisted into something predatory. The singing was coming from the basement. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I went back inside. I had to know what was down there, what had been calling to those spirits for over a century. The basement door was standing open when I reached it, though I was certain it had been locked before. The singing grew louder as I descended the stairs, joined by other sounds that made my skin crawl. Rattling chains, wet breathing, and underneath it all, that rhythmic pacing I'd been hearing all night. The basement was larger than I expected, extending far beyond the footprint of the building above. My flashlight revealed a maze of brick corridors and storage rooms, most of them flooded with several inches of that same black water I'd seen upstairs. But it wasn't water at all, I realized as the smell hit me. It was blood, old and thick and mixed with something else that my brain refused to identify. The singing led me deeper into the maze, past rooms filled with rusted medical equipment and shelves lined with glass jars containing things that should have been disposed of decades ago. In one room, I found dozens of hospital beds arranged in perfect rows, each one occupied by what looked like patients covered in white sheets. But when I got closer, I could see that the sheets were moving slightly, rising and falling as if the bodies underneath were still breathing. I didn't dare pull back any of those covers. The singing stopped abruptly when I reached the final room. This was the old morgue, and it was exactly as it had been left in 1918. Stone slabs arranged in neat rows, drainage channels cut into the floor, and along one wall, a series of metal drawers that had once held the victims of the Spanish flu pandemic. Most of the drawers were standing open, their contents long gone. But not all of them. 3 drawers were still closed, and I could hear movement inside them. Scratching, like fingernails against metal. The sound was getting more frantic, more desperate, as if whatever was trapped inside knew I was there and was trying to get my attention. Against every rational thought in my head, I reached for the handle of the first drawer. It slid open with a grinding screech that echoed through the basement like a scream. Inside was the perfectly preserved body of a young woman in a 1918 nurse's uniform. Her skin was white as fresh snow, and her eyes were wide open, staring directly at me with an expression of absolute terror. But she was breathing, slow, shallow breaths that made her chest rise and fall in a rhythm that matched the pacing I'd been hearing all night. Her mouth opened, and she began to speak in that same unknown language I heard in the singing. The words seemed to bypass my ears and go straight into my brain, carrying meanings that human language couldn't express. She was telling me about the others, about the patients who had died alone and afraid, about the promise that had been made to them in their final moments. They would never really die. They would wait in the space between life and death until someone came to witness their suffering, to remember their names, to carry their stories back to the world above. They had been waiting for over a century for someone like me to find them. I opened the second drawer, then the third, each one revealing another perfectly preserved victim of that terrible winter. A gold prospector with frostbite scars covering his hands, A child no more than 5 years old, clutching a wooden doll that had rotted away to nothing but splinters and cloth. All of them breathing. All of them speaking in that ancient language that filled my head with images I never wanted to see. Images of what really happened during the pandemic. How the hospital staff had made deals with forces they didn't, do you understand? Promising the souls of the dying in exchange for their own survival. How the basement had become a feeding ground for something that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between breathing in and breathing out. How that thing was still down there, still hungry after all these years, still waiting for fresh offerings. The preserved bodies sat up in their drawers as one, turning to look at me with those terrible, knowing eyes. They weren't angry or vengeful. They were grateful. I had finally come to complete the bargain their doctors had made a century ago. I was going to take their place, join them in that space between life and death, become another guardian of whatever ancient hunger lived in the hospital, its foundation. I ran. I dropped my flashlight and ran through the maze of corridors, following the sound of my own panic breathing back to the stairs. But the basement seemed to stretch on forever now, the walls shifting and changing as I stumbled through the darkness. Behind me, I could hear the sound of bare feet splashing through the black blood on the floor, moving with impossible speed as they chased me through the tunnels. I burst out of the basement and kept running until I reached my car. I drove straight home, packed everything I owned, and moved to Seattle the next day. I never went back to collect my final paycheck, never answered the calls from my supervisor asking what happened that night. But it doesn't matter how far I run, they followed me here. Every night at exactly 4 a.m., I wake up to the smell of that basement. Sweet flowers and old death, seeping through the walls of my apartment like invisible smoke. I can hear them singing their lullaby, calling to me in that language that speaks directly to something primal and terrified deep in my brain. The preserved bodies from those morgue drawers, still waiting for me to fulfill my part of the bargain. The worst part is that I am starting to understand what they re-saying. The words are becoming clearer each night, and with understanding comes the terrible knowledge of what I am supposed to do. They need a living person to anchor them to this world, someone to serve as a bridge between the space where they exist and the reality we call home. They need me to go back to the basement of Nome General Hospital and take my place in one of those open drawers. To become another perfectly preserved guardian, breathing slowly in the darkness while I wait for the next person to stumble into our trap. The city demolished the hospital 3 months ago, but I know that doesn't matter. The basement was never really part of the building above it. It exists in its own space, its own time, accessible to anyone who knows how to listen for the singing and follow the scent of flowers and decay. I started looking at airline tickets back to Alaska, not because I want to go, but because the pull is getting stronger every night. The voice is more insistent. Soon I want to have a choice in the matter. Soon I'll be walking down those basement stairs again, but this time I want to be running back up. If you ever find yourself in Nome, Alaska, and you hear children singing lullabies in the middle of the night, don't follow the sound. Don't investigate the sweet smell of rotting flowers that seems to rise from the ground itself. And whatever you do, don't try to help the perfectly preserved people who are still breathing in the space between life and death. Some bargains can never be broken. Some debts can never be paid. And some jobs require workers who can wait forever in the darkness, breathing slowly, patiently, until the next shift arrives. Story 4. Chulitna Trail. What the horse remembered. The horse appeared on my property at 3 in the morning, fully saddled, trembling, and covered in something that wasn't too much. I am a veterinarian who runs a small clinic outside Chulitna, Alaska, and in 30 years of practice, I've never seen an animal in such a state of terror. The mare was a beautiful chestnut quarter horse, maybe 8 years old, with expensive tack and a saddle that looked like it had been through hell. But it wasn't the condition of the equipment that made my blood run cold. It was the look in the horse, his eyes, like she had seen something that broke her mind. This happened 2 weeks ago, and I'm only telling this story now because I need someone else to know what I discovered. What I learned about the Chulitna Horse incident of 1991, and why that case was never really solved. Most people in Alaska remember the story. A saddled horse found wandering the wilderness near the Chulitna River. No rider anywhere to be found. Search teams combed thousands of acres looking for the missing person, following theories about bear attacks, river accidents, even UFO abduction. But they never found a body, never found any evidence of what happened to the rider who simply vanished into the Alaskan wilderness. What they didn't, is that it wasn't the first time. When the trembling mare showed up on my property, I immediately recognized the distinctive markings and build from the old news reports. This was a descendant of the original Chulitna horse, maybe even a direct offspring. But that would make her at least 32 years old, which was impossible. Horses don't live that long, and certainly not looking this young and strong. I brought her into the clinic and began my examination, trying to calm her down with soft words and gentle touches. That is when I noticed the marks. Thin scars running along her flanks and neck, too precise to be from barbed wire or natural injury. They looked almost surgical, like someone had been conducting experiments. But strangest of all were the marks on her hooves, burn patterns that formed symbols I didn't recognize. As I worked, I kept thinking about the original case. The horse found in 1991 had similar markings, according to the veterinary reports I read years ago. Similar scars, similar burn patterns, and the same look of absolute terror that never quite left its eyes. The official theory was that the rider had fallen during a storm, the horse had wandered for days, and the markings were from natural causes. But I knew better now. The mare kept looking toward the window facing north, toward the Chulitna River Valley. Every few minutes, she would start trembling again and make a sound I had never heard from a horse before. Not a whinny or neigh, but something closer to a human scream mixed with static, like a radio trying to pick up a distant signal. The sound raised goosebumps on my arms and made my clinic, as other animals, go completely silent. I sedated her for a more thorough examination, and that was when I found it. Embedded deep in the muscle tissue of her shoulder was a small metal object, about the size of a dime. It was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm, like a mechanical heartbeat. The metal was unlike anything I'd seen before, with a surface that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at it. When I removed the object, the mare stopped trembling for the first time since she arrived. But something else happened too. Images began flashing in my mind, vivid and terrifying, like someone was projecting memories directly into my brain. I saw the Chulitna River Valley from above, moving at impossible speed through the night sky. I saw other horses, dozens of them, running in perfect formation across terrain that defied physics. And I saw the riders. They weren't human, not exactly. Tall and thin, with limbs that bent in ways that hurt to look at. Their faces were hidden behind masks that seemed to be made of the same shifting metal as the object I removed from the horse. They moved with purpose, guiding their mounts through landscapes that existed somewhere between our world and someplace else entirely. The images showed me what happened to the missing riders from 1991 and all the other incidents that were never reported. They weren't killed or abducted in the way we understand those terms. They were transformed. Their bodies adapted for environments that human physiology was never meant to survive. The horses were the delivery system, bred and modified over generations to carry their riders between worlds. But sometimes a horse would rebel, break free from whatever control was being exerted over it, and flee back to our reality. That is what happened in 1991, and that is what had just happened to the mare in my clinic. She was a refugee from something that most people wouldn't believe if I told them. The metal object I removed was still warm in my palm, and as I held it, more images flooded my mind. I saw underground facilities built into the permafrost, where the rider creatures conducted their work. I saw maps of the Alaskan wilderness marked with locations where the barriers between worlds were thin enough to cross. And I saw myself, standing in my clinic, being watched through the eyes of a terrified horse. They knew where she was. They were coming to get her back. I tried to rationalize what I was experiencing, to find logical explanations for the metal object and the impossible images in my head. Maybe it was some kind of experimental tracking device. Maybe the images were hallucinations caused by electromagnetic fields. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. This was real, and I was in serious danger. The mare woke up from sedation completely calm for the first time, but her newfound peace was somehow more frightening than her terror had been. She stood perfectly still, looking directly at me with eyes that seemed far too intelligent for an animal. In those eyes, I could see recognition, gratitude, and something else that made my skin crawl. Pity. She knew what was coming for me, and she was sorry I'd gotten involved. That night, I took the mare and drove as far from my clinic as I could get, deep into the wilderness where cell phones don't to work and the nearest neighbor is 50 miles away. I decided to release her and destroy the metal object I removed, hoping that would end whatever nightmare I stumbled into. But as I led her from the trailer, I realized we weren't alone. The sky above the forest was wrong. Too dark, with stars arranged in patterns that defied everything I knew about astronomy. And moving between those impossible stars were shapes that my brain refused to process correctly. Aircraft of some kind, but built according to principles that human engineering had never discovered. They were searching for the mare, scanning the forest with beams of light that left strange marks on the trees where they touched. And when those beams found us, everything changed. Time seemed to slow down as the light washed over me. I could feel my thoughts being read, my memories examined like files in a cabinet. The creatures piloting those craft were trying to determine whether I was a threat, whether I needed to be eliminated or could be used for their purposes. The metal object in my pocket grew burning hot, and I could hear voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. The mare made that horrible screaming sound again, but this time I understood what she was trying to tell me. Run, hide, do anything except let them take me aboard those craft, because what they would do to me there was worse than death. I ran deeper into the forest, leaving the horse behind, clutching the burning metal object like a talisman that might protect me from whatever was hunting through the darkness above. Behind me, I could hear the sound of the mare being taken, lifted into one of those impossible aircraft. Her screams faded as she was carried away to whatever place exists between our world and theirs. I made it back to my truck and drove until sunrise, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that cursed valley. But it doesn't matter how far I run. The metal object I removed from the mare has changed me somehow, connected me to their network of riders and modified horses. I can feel them out there, conducting their experiments, preparing for something that will change everything we think we know about reality. Every night, I dream about riding through landscapes that shouldn't exist, guided by creatures that wear faces made of shifting metal. In these dreams, I am no longer human, no longer bound by the limitations of flesh and bone. I am something else, adapted for environments that exist in the spaces between worlds. And every morning, I wake up to find new scars on my body. Thin surgical marks that match the ones I saw on the mare, evidence that my transformation has already begun. The original Chulitna Horse incident of 1991 was never solved because the authorities were looking in the wrong dimension. They assumed the missing rider had died in our world, when in fact he had been taken to serve in another one entirely. The horse that escaped was trying to warn us, to show us that something was using our wilderness as a hunting ground for recruits. Now I understand why that first horse looked so terrified. It had seen what its rider became, what all the missing people become when they reselected for adaptation. And it knew that someday it would be forced to carry another human across that terrible threshold between worlds. I am leaving this account in case I disappear like all the others. If you ever encounter a saddled horse wandering alone in the Alaskan wilderness, don't try to help it. Don't examine it for injuries or remove any objects you might find embedded in its flesh. Just walk away and pretend you never saw anything. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some missing persons cases should stay cold forever. Because the alternative is discovering that the missing people aren't really missing at all. They were just serving their new masters in places that exist beyond the boundaries of human understanding. The scars on my body are getting deeper each night, and my dreams are becoming more vivid. Soon I want to be able to tell the difference between sleeping and waking, between this world and the place where the riders conduct their endless experiments. When that happens, I'll saddle up and join the hunt, searching the wilderness for the next person who needs to be adapted for service in the spaces between worlds. And maybe someday, my horse will break free and flee to someone else's property, carrying its own terrible memories of what I became. The cycle continues, and the Chulitna mystery deepens, one missing rider at a time. Story 5. Pipeline maintenance. The shadow shift. The shadows started following me during my third week working alone on the Trans-Alaska pipeline. And by the time I realized they weren't cast by anything real, it was already too late to run. My name is Dave, and I've been a pipeline maintenance technician for 12 years. The job pays well because nobody wants to spend months in isolation, checking pressure valves and monitoring systems across 800 miles of Alaskan wilderness. You work alone for weeks at a time, with nothing but tundra stretching to the horizon and the constant hum of oil flowing through steel pipes buried beneath the permafrost. I thought I could handle the solitude. I was wrong. The first shadow I noticed was moving wrong. I was doing routine maintenance at Pump Station 7, about 300 miles north of Fairbanks, when I saw it sliding across the snow without any object to cast it. At first, I assumed it was just fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. After 2 weeks of 16-hour shifts and nothing but freeze-dried meals, hallucinations seemed like the logical explanation. But shadows don't leave footprints in fresh snow. The prints were human-shaped but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. Too long, with what looked like extra joints in places where human feet don't bend. They followed the exact path of the shadow I'd seen, leading from the edge of my work area into the wilderness beyond. The tracks were deep, pressed into the snow with far more weight than any shadow should possess. That night, I started keeping a journal, documenting everything strange I encountered. Looking back at those entries now, I can see the progression of my descent into something that still doesn't have a name. The way my handwriting gradually became more erratic, the increasing paranoia creeping into every observation. Day 18 brought the first direct contact. I was replacing a faulty sensor about 50 miles south of Dead Horse when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. A tall, impossibly thin figure was standing maybe 100 yards away, perfectly motionless against the white landscape. When I turned my head to look directly at it, the figure was gone. But its shadow remained, dark against the snow, moving independently toward my position. The shadow reached me before I could retreat to my truck. It passed right over my boots, and I felt a cold so intense it burned, like stepping barefoot on dry ice. For just a moment, the shadow seemed to merge with mine, and I experienced something that still wakes me up screaming. I felt what it was like to exist without substance, to move through the world as nothing more than darkness and hunger. The shadow people weren't just stalking pipeline workers, they were trying to become us. Over the next few days, I started noticing patterns in their behavior. They appeared most often during the brief twilight hours when the sun hung low on the horizon, casting everything in long, distorted shadows that seemed to move independently. They were drawn to the pipeline itself, following its path through the wilderness like it was some kind of beacon calling to them from whatever place they originally came from. I researched the construction history during my off hours, using the satellite internet connection at the main camp. What I found chilled me more than the Arctic wind. During the pipeline, its construction in the 70s, workers had reported similar encounters. Shadowy figures that appeared at the edge of their vision, footprints that didn't match any known animal, and a growing sense of being watched by something that existed just outside normal perception. But the official reports buried these incidents, classifying them as stress-related hallucinations brought on by isolation and extreme weather conditions. The few workers who persisted in their claims were quietly transferred to other projects or dismissed entirely. The company couldn't afford to have rumors of supernatural activity affecting their workforce or public opinion. What the reports didn't mention was that some workers had disappeared entirely. Not officially missing, but transferred to other locations that didn't exist when you tried to follow up on their employment records. I found their names in old payroll documents, but no trace of them in current databases. It was like they had been systematically erased from existence. The shadow people were collecting them, I realized, taking them somewhere that existed parallel to our world but remained invisible to anyone who wasn't being actively hunted. By day 25, I could see them clearly even in bright sunlight. Tall, elongated figures that moved with fluid grace across terrain that would challenge even the most experienced Arctic traveler. They wore no clothing but seemed unaffected by temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. Their faces were indistinct, like looking at features through black water, but their eyes burned with an intelligence that felt older than human civilization. They were studying me, learning my patterns and behaviors. Every morning when I emerged from my heated shelter, they would be waiting at the edges of my vision, following as I went about my maintenance routine. At first, they maintained their distance, content to observe, but each day they grew bolder, coming closer to my work area, leaving more evidence of their presence. The footprints multiplied, forming complex patterns around the pipeline infrastructure that reminded me of ritualistic symbols from cultures I couldn't identify. Sometimes I would find objects arranged in geometric shapes near my equipment. Pieces of ice, fragments of metal, small bones from animals that didn't live in this region. The arrangements had a purpose I couldn't fathom, but they filled me with dread every time I encountered them. My radio communications with base camp became increasingly strained as I tried to report what I was experiencing. The dispatcher, his voice grew more concerned each day, not about the shadow people I described, but about my mental state. They started talking about sending a replacement, about medical evaluations and mandatory rest periods. I realized they thought I was having a breakdown, just like all the other workers who had encountered the shadows over the decades. But I wasn't crazy. The shadow people were real, and they were preparing for something. On day 32, I discovered what they wanted. I was working on a pressure valve when my shadow suddenly detached from my body, sliding across the snow to join a group of the shadow people who had been watching from nearby ridges. For several terrifying minutes, I stood in the Arctic sun casting no shadow at all, while my dark reflection communicated with the creatures in ways I couldn't understand. When my shadow returned, sliding back across the snow to rejoin my body, I knew things had changed fundamentally. I could feel their presence inside me now, like cold fingers moving through my bloodstream. They weren't just observing anymore. They were preparing me for integration into their reality. The process was gradual but irreversible. My body temperature began dropping even when I was inside heated shelters. My reflection in mirrors started showing subtle distortions, extra joints in my limbs, features that were becoming less distinctly human. Most disturbing of all, I found myself understanding their language, the silent communications they shared through gestures and movements that bypassed normal perception. They were ancient, these shadow people. They had existed in the spaces between light and darkness long before humans had learned to cast shadows of their own. The pipeline had disturbed something in the permafrost during its construction, creating a bridge between their dimension and ours. They had been slowly infiltrating our world ever since, replacing isolated workers with duplicates that could function in human society while serving their unknowable agenda. I tried to escape, driving my maintenance truck south toward the nearest populated area. But the shadows followed, keeping pace with my vehicle regardless of speed or terrain. They appeared in my headlight beams, ran alongside the truck with impossible grace, and cast their dark shapes across my windshield until I could barely see the road ahead. When I finally stopped, exhausted and terrified, I was no longer in Alaska. The landscape around me was familiar yet wrong, like a photograph that had been slightly altered. The pipeline was still there, but it stretched in directions that defied geography, extending through terrain that couldn't exist in normal space. This was their world, the shadow realm where they had been taking the missing workers for decades. And I wasn't alone. Other figures moved through the twilight landscape, people who had once been human but were now something else entirely. They wore the faces and clothes of pipeline workers, construction crews, and maintenance technicians, but their shadows moved independently, writhing and dancing according to their own mysterious purposes. They welcomed me with silent gestures, showing me the facilities they had built in this place between dimensions. Here, they continued their work, maintaining a version of the pipeline that existed outside normal reality. The oil that flowed through these shadow pipes wasn't petroleum, but something darker and more essential. They were harvesting the life force of the missing workers, processing it through infrastructure that mirrored but transcended the physical pipeline system. I understood now why the shadow people had been so patient in their stalking, so methodical in their approach. They needed willing participants, people who would choose to cross over rather than being forcibly taken. The isolation and stress of pipeline work made their targets more susceptible, more likely to accept the transformation when it was finally offered. The process was surprisingly painless. I felt my physical body dissolving as my consciousness merged with the shadow realm, becoming something that could exist in both dimensions simultaneously. I retained my memories and personality, but gained abilities that no human could possess. I could move at the speed of thought across vast distances, exist without food or warmth, and perceive realities that remained invisible to normal human senses. But I also understood the price of this transformation. I was no longer truly alive in any sense that mattered. I had become a harvester, responsible for identifying and preparing new candidates for integration into the shadow realm. The company would receive reports indicating that I had completed my assignment successfully and been transferred to a new location. In reality, I would be returning to the pipeline in my new form, stalking the next isolated worker who drew the unlucky assignment of maintaining the northern sections. This is my final communication from the human world, transmitted through systems that exist in the space between dimensions. If you work on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, or know someone who does, remember this warning. The shadows that move across the tundra aren't always cast by natural objects. Some of them are scouts, searching for people who can survive the transformation process. When you see footprints in the snow that don't match any living creature, when your shadow starts moving independently of your body, when figures appear at the edge of your vision that disappear when you look directly at them, it's already too late to escape. The shadow people have marked you for integration, and no amount of running or hiding will save you from your inevitable recruitment. I'm still out there, moving through the twilight spaces between your world and mine, still maintaining the pipeline that exists in dimensions beyond human understanding, still watching for the next worker who will join our ranks in the shadow realm. And someday, when you reworking alone in the Arctic wilderness, you might see me standing at the edge of your vision, a tall, familiar figure whose shadow moves independently across the snow, beckoning you toward a transformation that will free you from the limitations of human existence. When that day comes, dawn, to run, dawn, to fight. Just remember that the shadows cast by the Trans-Alaska Pipeline stretch far beyond the boundaries of our world, and some maintenance work can only be performed by people who no longer cast shadows of their own. Story 6. Iceman. This cursed the bullet hole in my kitchen window wasn't there when I went to bed, but it was there when I woke up, perfectly round, spider-webbed with cracks that caught the morning light like a frozen scream. Someone had taken a shot at my house while I slept, and the only reason I'm alive is because I'd fallen asleep on my couch instead of in bed. My name is David Chen, and I am a federal prosecutor in Anchorage, Alaska. 3 weeks ago, I took over the Thomas Wales murder case. 3 weeks ago, I started receiving death threats. 3 weeks ago, I began to understand that some cases aren't meant to be solved, and some killers are protected by forces that go deeper than law enforcement corruption. Thomas Wales was gunned down in his own home on October 11, 2001. Professional hit, single shot through his basement window while he worked late on case files. The bullet came from a .223 caliber rifle, fired from across the street with military precision. No witnesses, no forensic evidence, no leads that didn't disappear the moment investigators got close. What made the Wales case special wasn't just the victim. Thomas was building a massive organized crime case, tracking money laundering operations that stretched from Seattle to Vladivostok. Russian mafia, corrupt politicians, dirty cops. The kind of investigation that threatens billion-dollar criminal enterprises. The kind that gets prosecutors killed in their own homes. But here, it's what the media never reported. Thomas wasn't the first federal prosecutor to die under suspicious circumstances in Alaska. He was the seventh. 7 prosecutors over 15 years, all working cases that touched on the same shadowy network of corruption. Car accidents, hunting mishaps, sudden heart attacks. Thomas was just the first one they killed execution style, and even then, the case went cold faster than a body in permafrost. When I inherited the Wales file, it came with a warning from my supervisor. Pursue leads carefully. Don, to work along. Don, to take the case home. Standard precautions for sensitive investigations. What he didn't tell me was that the case file had been sanitized. Critical documents missing, witness statements redacted beyond recognition, evidence logs showing items that no longer existed in storage. The first death threat arrived by mail. Plain white envelope, no return address, postmarked in Anchorage. Inside, a single photograph of Thomas Wales taken through his basement window moments before his death. Written on the back in block letters. Some cases stay closed forever. The FBI told me it was probably a copycat, someone trying to scare me off an old case. They were wrong. I started digging deeper into Thomas's final months. His phone records, travel logs, the cases he was pursuing when he died. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Thomas had identified a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of Alaska state government. Judges taking bribes, police commissioners protecting smuggling operations, even federal agents selling information to organized crime syndicates. The deeper I dug, the more I understood why 7 prosecutors had died. They weren't just investigating crime. They were investigating the system designed to protect that crime. A system that had evolved over decades to eliminate threats with surgical precision. Thomas had gotten too close to naming names, and someone with serious resources had decided he needed to die. That is when the surveillance started. Black SUVs parked outside my house. Strange clicks on my phone line. Men in expensive suits photographing me from coffee shops and restaurants. I reported it to the FBI, but they claimed their security sweeps found nothing. Either they were incompetent, or they were compromised. In Alaska law enforcement, both possibilities were equally terrifying. The second death threat was more specific. Another photograph. This one showing me leaving the federal courthouse. On the back, coordinates to a location 40 miles outside Anchorage and a date 2 days in the future. The message was clear. Show up alone, or end up like Thomas Wales. I should have called for backup. I should have reported it immediately. Instead, I decided to go. The coordinates led to an abandoned mining camp in the Chugach Mountains. Buildings that had been empty for 30 years. Rusted equipment half buried in snow. Access roads that required a four-wheel drive and winter survival gear. The kind of place where bodies disappear until spring thaw, if they ever found at all. The kind of place perfect for making federal prosecutors vanish without a trace. I arrived at sunset, armed with my service weapon and a GPS tracker that would lead searchers to my body if things went wrong. The camp looked deserted, but fresh tire tracks in the snow told a different story. Someone had been here recently. Someone was probably here now, watching from the shadows of collapsed buildings and waiting for the right moment to make me the 8th dead prosecutor. That's when I found the cabin, hidden behind a stand of black spruce. Smoke rising from its chimney, warm light glowing in the windows. Someone was living here, 30 miles from the nearest road, in a camp that had been abandoned since the 1970s. Someone who wanted to meet with the prosecutor investigating the Thomas Wales murder. Inside the cabin sat an old man I'd never seen before. Native Alaskan, maybe 70 years old, wearing clothes that looked military surplus from decades past. He gestured for me to sit without saying a word, then poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that smelled like it had been brewing for hours. The silence stretched between us until I couldn't stand it anymore. He told me his name was Samuel Koyukon, and he'd been waiting 20 years to tell someone in law enforcement what he witnessed. Samuel had been working security for a private military contractor when Thomas Wales was murdered. Not the kind of security you hire for corporate events. The kind that specializes in making problems disappear permanently, using methods that don't show up in official investigations. The Wales hit wasn't random, Samuel explained. It was a demonstration, a message sent to every federal prosecutor in Alaska about what happens when investigations get too close to the truth. Thomas had identified 3 specific individuals who were coordinating the corruption network: a state Supreme Court justice, a senior FBI field agent, and a Russian businessman with ties to organized crime. All 3 were still alive, still in positions of power, still protected by the same network that had orchestrated Thomas's death. Samuel had been hired to provide perimeter security the night Thomas was killed. His job was to ensure no witnesses, no complications, no evidence that could trace back to his employers. But something had gone wrong with the plan. Thomas had survived the first shot and tried to crawl to safety. Samuel watched through night vision optics as the sniper fired 2 more rounds, execution style, into a wounded man begging for his life. The guilt had been eating Samuel alive for 20 years. He tried to go to the police, but corrupt officers buried his statements. He tried to contact federal investigators, but his calls were never returned. He finally decided that the only way to expose the truth was to find someone still investigating the case and hope they had the courage to see it through. But courage wasn't going to be enough, Samuel warned me. The same network that had killed Thomas was still operating, still eliminating threats, still protected by layers of official corruption that reached into agencies I was supposed to trust. If I continued the investigation, I'd end up like the other 7 prosecutors. Another tragic accident, another case that would be quietly reassigned and eventually forgotten. Samuel handed me a manila envelope containing evidence he collected over 20 years. Photographs of the hit team, financial records showing payments to corrupt officials, intercepted communications discussing future targets. Everything I needed to blow the conspiracy wide open, and everything that would get me killed the moment I tried to use it. I left the cabin that night understanding something that still keeps me awake 3 weeks later. Justice isn't blind in Alaska. It is bought and paid for by people with enough money and power to murder federal prosecutors in their own homes. The Wales case wasn't unsolved. It was protected by a network of corruption so deep that even attempting to investigate it was a death sentence. The bullet hole in my kitchen window appeared 2 days after I met with Samuel. A warning shot, fired with the same precision as the bullet that killed Thomas Wales. The message was clear. Stop digging, or join the other 7 prosecutors who had gotten too close to the truth. The FBI responded to my report by reassigning me to tax fraud cases and recommending I take extended leave for stress-related anxiety. But I can't stop thinking about Samuel, this evidence. About Thomas Wales working late in his basement, unaware that a sniper, his scope was tracking his movement through the window. About 6 other prosecutors who died under suspicious circumstances, their cases quietly buried along with their bodies. About a system of justice so corrupted that the people sworn to uphold it had become the very criminals they were supposed to prosecute. The worst part isn't the death threats or the surveillance or the knowledge that powerful people want me dead. The worst part is understanding that they were going to get away with it. Just like they got away with murdering Thomas Wales. Just like they got away with killing 6 other prosecutors who tried to expose the truth. Just like they'll get away with whatever happens to me. Tonight, I'm writing this confession and hiding it where investigators will find it if I don't survive the week. If you rereading this, it means the network finally decided I knew too much. It means I became the 8th prosecutor to die under mysterious circumstances while investigating organized crime in Alaska. It means they won again, and justice lost another round in a game where the rules are written by killers. The bullet hole in my kitchen window is still there, spider-webbed with cracks that catch the light like ice. Sometimes, late at night, I stare at it and wonder if the next shot will find its target. Sometimes I think it would be easier to just stop asking questions. Stop digging for truth in a system built on lies and corruption. Sometimes I think Thomas Wales might have been lucky to die quickly, before he learned how deep the darkness really goes. But then I remember Samuel Koyukon, waiting 20 years for someone brave enough to listen. I remember Thomas Wales, murdered for trying to do his job with integrity. I remember the 6 prosecutors who died before him, and I know that someone has to keep digging. Someone has to expose the truth, even if it costs them everything. Even if it costs them their life. Story 7. Vanishing of the Chulitna Horse. I never believed in ghosts until I drove the Old Glen Highway alone at 3 in the morning, searching for answers about a woman who died before I was born. My name is Marcus, and I work for the Alaska State Troopers as a cold case investigator. 3 months ago, my captain handed me a file so thick it required 2 rubber bands to hold together. The label read, Chulitna Horse 1980 Unsolved. He told me to take a fresh look, said maybe modern DNA techniques could finally identify the woman whose brutal murder had haunted our department for over 40 years. What he didn't tell me was that everyone who had worked this case before me either requested transfers or quit the force entirely. The photographs inside that file still burn behind my eyelids when I try to sleep. A young woman, maybe 25 years old, found beaten to death near mile marker 12 on the Old Glen Highway. Her body had been there for weeks before hunters discovered her remains scattered by wildlife. No identification, no missing person reports that matched, no witnesses, just a corpse wearing clothes that seemed decades out of style, even for 1980. The strangest detail was her jewelry. She wore a silver locket that contained a photograph of a man in a military uniform, but the image quality suggested it was taken during World War II. The woman in the morgue was far too young to have been alive during that war, yet she clutched that locket like her life depended on it. I spent weeks reviewing witness statements, police reports, and crime scene analysis. Every lead ended in dead ends or impossibilities. 3 different people claimed to have seen her hitchhiking along various Alaska highways in the months before her death, but their descriptions placed her in locations hundreds of miles apart on the same day. One trucker swore he picked her up outside Fairbanks on a Tuesday, while a gas station attendant in Anchorage insisted she bought cigarettes from him that same Tuesday afternoon. The medical examiner's report contained details that made no sense. Her teeth showed signs of dental work that wouldn't be invented until the 1990s. Yet she died in 1980. Her stomach contents included traces of a preservative that wasn't approved for food use until 1985. Blood tests revealed unusual mineral concentrations that suggested she had been drinking water from sources that didn't exist anywhere in Alaska. But the detail that kept me awake at night was the coroner's note about her body temperature. When the hunters found her, she had been dead for at least 3 weeks according to decomposition patterns. Yet her core body temperature was still 98.6 degrees. I decided to visit the crime scene myself, hoping that seeing the location might provide insights the photographs couldn't capture. The Old Glen Highway stretches through some of the most isolated wilderness in America, winding through dense forests where cell phone signals disappear and the nearest town is an hour's drive away. Mile marker 12 sits at the bottom of a shallow valley, surrounded by towering spruce trees that block out most of the sunlight even during summer days. I arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty road. The spot where her body was found is marked only by a small cross someone had planted years ago. The metal was rusted and bent, as if something had tried to tear it from the ground repeatedly. As I examined the area, I noticed something the original investigators had missed. Carved into the bark of a nearby tree, about 7 feet off the ground, were the words, "She waits," followed by a series of numbers that looked like coordinates. The carving was fresh, the bark still weeping sap, yet the style of the lettering matched engravings I had seen in century-old graveyards. I followed the coordinates using my GPS, hiking deeper into the forest as darkness fell around me. The numbers led to a clearing where someone had built a makeshift camp. Tattered pieces of canvas hung from tree branches like prayer flags, and the remains of multiple campfires formed a perfect circle in the center of the space. But these weren't recent camps. The canvas was rotted through, and the fire rings were filled with decades of accumulated leaves and debris. In the center of the circle, someone had arranged stones to spell out Annie over and over again. Hundreds of stones, forming the same name in letters 3 feet tall. But as I studied the arrangement closer, I realized the stones weren't local. They were smooth river rocks that had been carried from somewhere else, each one painted with a single red letter in what looked like nail polish. That's when I heard the crying. It started as a soft whimper coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, the sound a lost child might make when calling for help. But as I listened, the crying grew closer and more distinct. It was definitely a woman's voice, speaking words I couldn't quite understand, as if she were calling out in a language I had never heard before. I followed the sound, using my flashlight to navigate between the trees. The crying led me to an old logging road that wasn't marked on any current maps. The road surface was cracked asphalt, buckled and split by decades of frost heaves, but I could see recent tire tracks pressed into the soft ground at the edges. The crying stopped suddenly, replaced by absolute silence. Even the normal forest sounds had disappeared. No wind through the leaves, no insects chirping, no distant owl calls. Just complete, unnatural quiet that pressed against my eardrums like water pressure. Then I saw her. A woman stood in the middle of the old logging road about 50 yards ahead of me, perfectly illuminated by my flashlight beam despite the fact that she cast no shadow on the ground behind her. She wore a yellow sundress that seemed to glow with its own light, and her long dark hair moved in a breeze I couldn't feel. She was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at directly, like staring into the sun. She raised one hand and beckoned for me to come closer. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and run, but I found myself walking toward her instead. Each step felt like I was moving through thick mud, my legs heavy and unresponsive. The closer I got, the more details I could see. Her dress was torn in several places, revealing dark stains that looked like dried blood. Her feet were bare and cut, leaving wet footprints on the dry asphalt behind her. But it was her eyes that paralyzed me with terror. They were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible surface, like looking into deep water at night. And in that darkness, I could see movement, as if something alive was swimming around inside her skull. She opened her mouth to speak, and her voice came from everywhere at once, echoing off trees that stood too far away to create echoes. "Find him," she whispered, and suddenly I understood that this was Annie, the woman from the photographs. But she looked exactly the same as she had in 1980, not a day older, while 40 years had passed in the real world. "Find who?" I tried to ask, but no sound came from my throat. "The one who made me this way," she replied, though I hadn't spoken aloud. "The one who won. Let me rest." Images flooded my mind, flashing by too quickly to process completely but leaving impressions burned into my memory. A man in a truck, offering her a ride. A cabin hidden so deep in the wilderness that it didn't appear on satellite maps. Things done to her that were worse than death, experiments that blended science with something darker and older. And then I saw the most terrifying image of all. The man was still alive, still doing the same things to other women, still hiding in that same cabin, protected by something that wasn't entirely human. The visions ended abruptly, and I found myself alone on the logging road. Annie had vanished, but the smell of decay lingered in the air around me. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in complete darkness in the middle of the Alaska wilderness. I stumbled back through the forest using my phone, its dim screen as a light source, branches tearing at my clothes and face as I crashed through underbrush in my panic to reach my truck. By the time I made it back to the highway, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the ignition key. The next morning, I drove straight to the state police archives and pulled every file related to missing women in Alaska since 1975. What I found made my blood turn cold. 17 women had disappeared along remote highways throughout the state, all fitting the same general description as Annie. All had been seen hitchhiking shortly before they vanished, and all had been reported as carrying unusual jewelry or personal items that seemed much older than they were. But here is what kept me awake for the next 3 weeks. According to multiple witness statements, all 17 women had been seen alive and hitchhiking within the past 5 years. Some had been spotted as recently as last month. Women who had been missing for decades were still being seen on Alaska highways, still wearing the same clothes, still looking exactly the same age as when they first disappeared. I realized that Annie's murder was a cold case that needed solving. It was an ongoing crime that had never stopped. The coordinates carved into that tree led me to more than just an old campsite. They led me to a pattern of disappearances that stretched back to the 1940s, all centered around a 10-mile stretch of the old Glen Highway that locals had been avoiding for generations without really knowing why. I started interviewing elderly residents of the nearest towns, asking about legends and stories connected to that area. What I learned convinced me that some cases are too dangerous to solve alone. They told me about a man who bought land in those mountains during World War II, claiming to be a government researcher studying cold weather survival techniques. They said he built a compound back in the forest, far from any road, accessible only by helicopter or a hiking trail that takes 2 days to navigate. They said trucks would arrive at his compound in the middle of the night, carrying supplies and sometimes passengers who never came back out. And they told me that people still see lights moving through those mountains on clear nights, even though the government insists the compound was abandoned decades ago. But what frightened me most was what they said about the women. According to local legend, the researcher had found a way to preserve his victims, keeping them conscious and aware long after their physical bodies should have died. They said he collected women like specimens, trapping their souls in forms that could never rest, never age, never escape. The women still walk the highways, they said, searching for someone brave enough or foolish enough to help them find peace. I filed my report with the state police, recommending that the case be transferred to federal authorities with resources to investigate the compound. But my captain pulled me aside and told me the FBI had already looked into those allegations multiple times over the past 40 years. Each investigation had been closed without explanation, and the agents involved had been reassigned to different cases far from Alaska. He suggested I close the Annie file and move on to something else. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've driven the old Glen Highway every night after my shift ends, hoping to see Annie again. Not because I want to, but because I need to know what she wants me to do. The images she showed me to leave my head, and I can shake the feeling that 17 women are still suffering somewhere in those mountains, waiting for someone to help them. Last night, I finally saw her again. She was standing beside mile marker 12, exactly where her body had been found 40 years ago. But this time, she wasn't alone. 16 other women stood with her, all wearing clothes from different decades, all staring at me with eyes that reflected my headlights like mirrors. They didn't beckon this time. They just watched as I drove past, and I could feel their gaze following my truck until I rounded the next curve and they disappeared from my rearview mirror. I am writing this at 4 a.m, sitting in my kitchen with every light in the house turned on. Tomorrow, I'm going to request a transfer to another department, maybe somewhere warm like Arizona where the desert sun burns away shadows and secrets. But I know it won't matter where I go. Annie and the others will follow me, appearing in my peripheral vision, whispering coordinates and clues and pleas for help that I'm too scared to answer. Because the truth is, I know exactly where that compound is located. The coordinates from my visions match a spot on the map that is marked as restricted government land, inaccessible to civilians. And every time I close my eyes, I can see the road I would need to take to get there. The women are still waiting for someone to find them, still hoping that someday, someone will be brave enough to walk into those mountains and face whatever keeps them trapped between life and death. But it won to be me. I've seen what happens to people who get too close to the truth about Chulitna Annie. 3 investigators before me tried to solve this case, and all 3 died in apparent accidents within months of their last reports. Car crashes on clear roads, hunting accidents where experienced outdoorsmen shot themselves, heart attacks in healthy men who had no history of cardiac problems. The official cause of Annie's death was listed as homicide by person or persons unknown. But I think the real truth is much worse than a simple murder. I think someone found a way to make death into something worse than dying. And I think they were still doing it. If you ever driving through Alaska late at night, and you see a woman in a yellow dress standing beside the Old Glen Highway near mile marker 12, don't stop. Don't even slow down. Just keep driving, and try not to look in your rearview mirror. Because some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved. Story 8. Alaska Triangle. Congressman S. Flight 727. I found the flight recorder from Congressman Nick Begich's plane 47 years after it vanished. And what I heard on that tape made me understand why some secrets should stay buried in Alaska's frozen wilderness. My name is David Chen, and I work as a salvage recovery specialist for the National Transportation Safety Board. My job takes me to places where aircraft have crashed in remote locations, usually months or years after the initial accident. I extract black boxes, analyze wreckage, and piece together the final moments of flights that ended in tragedy. 3 months ago, I received an assignment that seemed routine on paper. A small section of aircraft debris had been spotted by satellite imagery in a glacier field about 60 miles northeast of Anchorage. The debris signature matched the approximate size and composition of a Cessna 310, which aligned with one of Alaska's most famous unsolved aviation mysteries. On October 16, 1972, Congressman Hale Boggs and Congressman Nick Begich boarded a chartered Cessna 310 at Anchorage International Airport, bound for Juneau. The flight should have taken 3.5 hours. Instead, the plane disappeared completely somewhere over the vast wilderness between the two cities, taking 4 men with it and spawning decades of conspiracy theories about government cover-ups and supernatural phenomena. The search operation was the largest in Alaska's history at that time. Military aircraft, civilian volunteers, and Coast Guard vessels scoured over 32,000 square miles of mountains, forests, and ocean. They found nothing, not a single piece of debris, no oil slicks, no emergency beacon signals. The plane had simply ceased to exist. What made the disappearance even stranger was the weather. October 16th was clear and calm throughout southern Alaska, with perfect visibility and light winds. The pilot, Don Johns, was experienced and familiar with the route. The aircraft had been recently serviced and was in excellent mechanical condition. There was no logical reason for the flight to encounter any problems. But as I studied the case files during my flight to Alaska, I discovered details that the public had never been told. In the weeks leading up to the disappearance, air traffic controllers at both Anchorage and Juneau had reported unusual radar contacts in the area where the plane vanished. Objects that appeared and disappeared without explanation, moving at speeds and in patterns that defied conventional aircraft capabilities. 3 separate commercial pilots had radioed in sightings of strange lights in that same region during the month before Boggs and Begich disappeared. The lights were described as brilliant white orbs that pulsed with regular intervals, sometimes stationary, sometimes moving in perfect geometric formations that suggested intelligent control. The official reports dismissed these sightings as natural phenomena or misidentified conventional aircraft. But I noticed something the original investigators had missed. Every pilot who reported seeing the strange lights also reported temporary equipment malfunctions during their sightings. Compass needles spinning wildly, radio communications filled with static, and navigation instruments providing readings that made no sense. My helicopter dropped me at a landing zone about 2 miles from the debris site. The location was a narrow valley between 2 massive peaks, accessible only during a brief window of good weather that occurs maybe 30 days per year. The glacier that had preserved the wreckage was retreating due to climate change, slowly revealing debris that had been frozen in ice for nearly 5 decades. What I found defied every expectation based on my 20 years of crash investigation experience. The wreckage was scattered across roughly half a mile, but not in the pattern you would expect from an aircraft impact. Instead of a concentrated debris field with the heaviest pieces at the front, the wreckage was arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, as if the plane had been disassembled in midair and the pieces had been deliberately placed on the ground. The largest section was the tail assembly, which showed no signs of impact damage. The metal was twisted and deformed, but not in ways consistent with hitting the ground or hitting another object. Instead, the aluminum looked like it had been subjected to intense electromagnetic forces, bent and warped in directions that suggested the metal had become temporarily fluid before solidifying again. But it was the cockpit section that made my hands shake as I photographed it for my report. The instrument panel was completely melted, but only the electronic components. The metal framework was untouched, as were the seats and other non-electronic materials. It looked like someone had used a precisely targeted energy weapon that affected only electrical systems. And embedded in the center of the melted instrument panel was a black box that should not have existed. The Cessna 310 was not equipped with a flight data recorder or cockpit voice recorder in 1972. Those devices were only required on commercial aircraft at that time. Yet here was a standard aviation black box, its orange exterior unmarked by whatever force had destroyed everything around it. I extracted the device and ran preliminary tests using my portable equipment. The recorder showed signs of activity right up until the moment the plane disappeared, which meant it had been recording throughout the entire incident. But when I connected it to my laptop to download the audio files, I discovered something that should have been impossible. The recording was 18 hours long. Flight 727 from Anchorage to Juneau should have taken 3.5 hours at most. Even if the plane had been lost and flying in circles until it ran out of fuel, the maximum recording time should have been about 6 hours. But this device had somehow captured 18 continuous hours of audio from the cockpit, starting with normal pre-flight communications and ending with something I still hear in my nightmares. I made the decision to listen to the entire recording before reporting my findings to my superiors. What I heard convinced me that some mysteries are too dangerous for the general public to know about. The first 3 hours were exactly what you would expect. Normal pilot communications, routine navigation updates, casual conversation between the congressmen and their staff members. Don Johns was calm and professional, occasionally pointing out landmarks to his passengers as they flew over the spectacular Alaska landscape. But at 3 hours and 17 minutes into the flight, something changed. Don Johns' voice became confused and concerned. He reported to air traffic control that his navigation instruments were providing contradictory readings. His compass was pointing in different directions simultaneously, and his altimeter showed the aircraft ascending and descending at the same time. Air traffic control tried to provide radar guidance, but they were having problems too. The radar signature of the Cessna kept disappearing and reappearing in locations that were hundreds of miles apart within seconds. One moment the plane appeared to be over the Gulf of Alaska. The next moment it seemed to be inland near Denali, then back over the ocean again. But the strangest part was that Don Johns reported seeing the sun in the wrong position. According to his instruments, the flight was heading southeast toward Juneau, but he could see the sun directly ahead of the aircraft, which would have been impossible during an afternoon flight in October. At 4 hours and 32 minutes, one of the passengers began describing something outside the aircraft windows. The voice was difficult to identify from the recording, but he sounded terrified as he tried to explain what he was seeing. The landscape below the aircraft was wrong, he said. Instead of the familiar mountains and forests of southern Alaska, he could see structures that looked like cities, but not cities built by human beings. Geometric patterns that stretched for miles, made from materials that reflected light in ways that hurt to look at directly. And then he said something that made me stop the recording and check it 3 times to make sure I had heard correctly. He said the cities were moving. The geometric patterns were shifting and rearranging themselves as the aircraft flew overhead, as if they were alive and responding to the presence of the plane. By hour 6, all 4 men aboard the aircraft were discussing what they were seeing, and their descriptions became increasingly difficult to believe. They reported that the sky itself had changed color, shifting from blue to deep purple to colors that they couldn't name. Stars were visible even though it should have been daylight, but the stars were arranged in constellations that didn't match any known star patterns. Don Johns tried repeatedly to contact air traffic control, but instead of normal radio responses, the speakers in the cockpit began broadcasting sounds that resembled human voices speaking in reverse, mixed with electronic tones that seemed to pulse in rhythm with a heartbeat. Hour 8 was when I first heard them. Other voices began appearing on the recording, voices that weren't coming from inside the cockpit. They sounded like radio transmissions, but they were speaking in a language that didn't match any human language I had ever heard. The voices were calm and methodical, as if they were conducting some kind of scientific observation or experiment. But what terrified me was that occasionally, I could understand fragments of what they were saying. Not because I recognized the language, but because the meaning appeared directly in my mind as I listened, bypassing my ears entirely. They were discussing the aircraft and its occupants like specimens in a laboratory. They referenced previous acquisitions from the same geographic area, mentioning dates that went back decades. They talked about the usefulness of political figures for their research, and whether the current subjects would provide better data than previous samples. By hour 10, the 4 men aboard the Cessna had stopped talking entirely. The only sounds were the aircraft engines, which continued running normally despite everything else that was happening. But occasionally, I could hear breathing, and the breathing didn't sound entirely human anymore. It was too slow, too deep, as if the respiratory systems of the passengers had been altered somehow. Hour 12 contained the most disturbing material. The voices that weren't from inside the cockpit began communicating directly with the passengers. But the responses from Boggs, Begich, Don Johns, and the 4th passenger sounded wrong. Their voices had become monotone and mechanical, as if they were speaking words that someone else was putting into their mouths. The external voices were asking questions about government operations, military installations, and political processes. The passengers answered with information that should have been classified or confidential, providing details about defense projects and congressional activities as if they were reading from prepared scripts. But the questions weren't just about government secrets. The voices also asked about human biology, social structures, and psychological patterns. They seemed to be using the passengers as sources of information about the entire human species. Hour 14 was when I realized that the men aboard that aircraft were no longer entirely human. Their responses to questions had become too detailed, too comprehensive. They were providing information about topics they couldn't possibly have known about, describing scientific concepts and historical events with perfect accuracy despite having no expertise in those areas. It was as if their minds had been connected to some vast database of human knowledge. And then I heard something that made me understand why this case had remained classified for so long. One of the external voices mentioned coordinates, geographic locations where similar acquisitions had taken place over the past century. The coordinates corresponded to dozens of unexplained disappearances throughout Alaska, including missing aircraft, ships, and individual people who had vanished without trace. The Alaska Triangle wasn't just a region where people disappeared due to harsh weather and difficult terrain. It was a collection zone, a place where something had been systematically gathering human subjects for decades. Hour 16 contained technical discussions about human consciousness and methods for preserving awareness during physical transformation processes. The voices spoke casually about procedures that sounded like science fiction, but with the clinical precision of medical professionals discussing routine surgery. They explained that consciousness could be separated from biological systems and transferred to more durable storage mediums. They mentioned that previous subjects had been successfully maintained in active states for years after their physical forms had been discontinued. And they said that Congressman Boggs and Congressman Begich would make excellent additions to their research facility because of their extensive knowledge about human governmental systems. Hour 17 was almost silent except for mechanical humming and occasional electronic tones. But near the end, I heard Don John speaking one final time. His voice was barely recognizable, distorted by some process that had changed him on a fundamental level. He said he could see the research facility where they were being taken. He described it as a structure that existed partially outside normal three-dimensional space, accessible only through specific geometric alignments that occurred naturally in certain geographic locations. He said the facility contained thousands of subjects collected over centuries, all of them maintained in conscious states for ongoing study. He said the researchers weren't human, but they weren't entirely alien either. They were something that had been observing and studying human development since the beginning of recorded history. Hour 18 ended abruptly with a sound like reality itself tearing apart. I submitted my official report to the NTSB 3 weeks ago, but I only included the first 3 hours of the recording. I claimed that the black box had been damaged and the remaining data was corrupted beyond recovery. I recommended that the case be closed as an unexplained aircraft accident with no recoverable evidence. But I kept the complete recording, and they've been listening to it every night since I returned from Alaska. Not because I want to, but because I need to understand what happened to those 4 men and whether it's still happening to others. The coordinates mentioned in the recording correspond to locations where aircraft and ships continue to disappear even today. The Alaska Triangle is still active, still collecting subjects for research that serves purposes I can begin to comprehend. And I think they know that I know. 2 weeks ago, I started receiving phone calls from numbers that don't exist in any directory. When I answer, I hear the same electronic tones that were recorded on Flight 727, mixed with voices speaking in that impossible language that bypasses my ears and speaks directly to my mind. They were asking me questions about my work, about the recording, about what I plan to do with the information I've discovered. And sometimes, when I'm too tired to resist, I find myself answering their questions with information I don't remember sharing. Last night, I looked in the mirror and saw that my eyes had changed color. They were still brown, but now there are flecks of silver that weren't there before, and sometimes I can see things reflected in them that aren't in the room behind me. I think the process has already started. If you re-listening to this, then they'd probably joined Congressman Boggs and Congressman Begich in whatever facility exists in the spaces between normal reality. Don, to try to find the recording or investigate the coordinates I mentioned. Don, to search for the wreckage site or attempt to recover additional evidence. Some secrets are kept secret because revealing them puts you on a list of potential research subjects. The Alaska Triangle is still hungry, and it's been getting hungrier every year. Just stay away from small aircraft in Alaska, especially if you flying routes that take you over the wilderness between Anchorage and Juneau. And if you ever hear electronic tones coming from your radio or phone, hang up immediately. Don, to listen long enough to let them start asking questions. Because once they know, they'll never stop watching you. And eventually, they'll decide you would make an excellent addition to their collection. Story 9. Butcher Baker, Robert Hansen. His hunting grounds. I found his hunting cabin by accident, 40 years after Robert Hansen was supposed to be dead. And what I discovered inside made me realize that some monsters never truly die. My name is Jake Morrison, and I work as a bush pilot in Alaska, flying supplies to remote cabins and mining operations scattered across the wilderness. Last month, I was forced to make an emergency landing during a sudden whiteout storm, setting down on a frozen lake about 80 miles northeast of Anchorage. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping me in terrain so remote that my GPS showed nothing but blank white space for 50 miles in every direction. On the second day, when my food supplies were running low, I spotted smoke rising from a cluster of trees about half a mile from where my plane was grounded. I hiked through knee-deep snow toward the smoke, expecting to find another stranded pilot or maybe a trapper waiting out the storm. Instead, I found a log cabin that looked like it had been abandoned for decades, with boarded windows and a roof partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. But smoke was definitely rising from the chimney, and I could see the orange glow of firelight through cracks in the boarded windows. I knocked on the door, calling out that whoever was inside, but received no response. The door was unlocked, so I pushed it open and stepped into what looked like a museum dedicated to human suffering. The walls were covered with photographs of women, hundreds of them, arranged in neat rows from floor to ceiling. But these weren't normal portraits. They were hunting photographs, the kind trophy hunters take with their kills, except the trophies were young women posed like deer or elk. Each photo was labeled with a date, a name, and coordinates that presumably marked where the hunt had taken place. In the center of the room sat a massive wooden desk covered with detailed topographical maps of Alaska. Red pins marked dozens of locations throughout the wilderness, connected by lines drawn in what looked like dried blood. At each marked location, someone had written numbers indicating how many victims had been taken there. But what made my stomach turn was the realization that many of the dates on the photographs were recent. Some were from last year, some were from last month. The most recent was dated just 3 days ago. Robert Hansen, the serial killer known as the Butcher Baker, had supposedly died in prison in 2014. The FBI had closed his case after confirming his death and accounting for all known victims. But the evidence in this cabin suggested that either Hansen had faked his death, or someone was continuing his work with terrifying precision. I photographed everything I could with my phone, planning to turn the evidence over to authorities as soon as I could get back to civilization. But as I examined the maps more closely, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. One of the red pins marked the exact location where my plane had been forced down. According to the notations on the map, this location had been used for hunts 17 times over the past 4 years. The most recent entry was dated yesterday, with a note that read, "New arrival confirmed. Weather conditions optimal. Begin preparation." I realized that my emergency landing hadn't been an accident. Someone had been tracking my flight path and had somehow caused my navigation instruments to malfunction, forcing me to land at a predetermined location where I would become the next trophy in their collection. I ran back to my plane as fast as the deep snow would allow, but when I reached the lake, I discovered that my aircraft had been sabotaged. The engine cowling had been removed, and critical components had been taken, leaving the plane completely inoperable. Worse, my emergency radio had been smashed, cutting off any possibility of calling for rescue. Fresh snowmobile tracks led away from my plane in multiple directions, suggesting that whoever had sabotaged it was still in the area, possibly watching me from concealment. That is when I heard the sound that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the wind, I could hear a woman screaming. I followed the sound through the forest, moving as quietly as possible through the snow. The screaming led me to a clearing where someone had built what could only be described as a hunting blind, complete with camouflage walls and shooting ports that provided clear fields of fire in multiple directions. But this wasn't designed for hunting animals. The shooting ports were positioned at human height, and the ground in front of the blind was marked with distance markers, like a rifle range designed specifically for hunting people. The screaming was coming from somewhere beyond the clearing, deeper in the forest. As I moved closer, I could make out words mixed with the screams. A woman's voice pleading for help, begging someone to let her go. I found her in a cage. It was a metal structure about the size of a large dog kennel, suspended from a tree branch about 8 feet off the ground. Inside was a young woman, maybe 25 years old, wearing torn clothes that looked like they had once been a cocktail dress. She was injured, bleeding from cuts on her arms and face, but very much alive. When she saw me, she stopped screaming and stared with eyes that held a mixture of hope and terror. She had been used as bait, I realized, left in the cage where her screams would attract anyone who might be in the area, drawing them into the open where they could be hunted. I looked around for something to stand on so I could reach the cage, but that is when I heard the helicopter. It was approaching fast and low, the distinctive whop 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 of rotor blades echoing off the mountains around us. But this wasn't a rescue helicopter. This was the hunter, arriving to begin the game. I grabbed the woman from the cage and ran, carrying her through the forest as the helicopter circled overhead, searching for us with a powerful spotlight that turned the snow-covered trees into a maze of harsh shadows and blinding light. The pilot was skilled, using the helicopter like a bird of prey, hovering motionless above the treetops before suddenly diving toward us, forcing us to change direction and run toward areas where the terrain would provide better hunting opportunities. I began to understand the sick logic of the game. We weren't just being hunted, we were being herded, driven toward specific locations where the killer could pursue us on foot with a clear advantage. But I knew these forests better than most people. I had been flying over Alaska wilderness for 15 years, and I had studied topographical maps of this region for emergency landing purposes. I knew where there were cliffs and ravines that a helicopter couldn't follow, and I knew where there were caves and rock formations that could provide temporary shelter. As we ran, the woman told me her name was Sarah, and she had been abducted from a bar in Anchorage 3 days ago. The man who took her looked exactly like Robert Hansen, even though she knew that was impossible because Hansen was supposed to be dead. She described being flown to this remote location in a small plane, then released into the wilderness and told that she had 24 hours to hide before the hunt began. She had been surviving on her own for 3 days, evading capture while other hunters searched for her on snowmobiles and on foot. But what terrified her most was that she wasn't the first. She had found evidence of previous hunts, including personal belongings and remains of other victims scattered throughout the forest. Some of the evidence was recent, but some appeared to be decades old, suggesting that the hunting operation had been continuous since Hansen's original crimes in the 1980s. We reached a rocky outcropping that provided temporary concealment from the helicopter, and I was able to examine the evidence Sarah had collected. Driver's licenses, jewelry, and personal items from women who had disappeared throughout Alaska over the past 40 years. But the most disturbing discovery was a journal, written in Hansen's distinctive handwriting, that documented his fake death and his continued operations after his supposed demise. According to the entries, he had been recruited by a group of wealthy individuals who shared his interests in hunting human prey. The journal described a network of similar operations throughout North America, connected by private aircraft and supported by people in law enforcement and government who ensured that investigations would be misdirected or closed without resolution. Hansen hadn't acted alone during his original crimes, and he hadn't been working alone when he faked his death. He was part of a larger organization that treated human hunting as a business, providing services to clients who paid enormous amounts of money for the opportunity to hunt the most dangerous game. The journal listed names, dates, and locations of hunts that had taken place across Alaska, Canada, and the northwestern United States. Hundreds of missing person cases that had been attributed to wilderness accidents or natural causes were actually documented murders committed for sport and profit. As I read the journal, I began to understand why my emergency landing had been orchestrated. I wasn't just a random victim. I had been specifically selected because of my knowledge of Alaska wilderness and my skills as a pilot. The hunters wanted someone who would provide a more challenging and entertaining pursuit. But they had made a mistake. They had underestimated how well I knew this terrain and how far I was willing to go to survive. I led Sarah through a series of ravines and ridge lines that I knew from my flying experience, moving toward a location where I remembered seeing an old mining camp during previous flights. If the camp was still there, it might contain supplies and possibly communication equipment that could help us call for rescue. The helicopter followed us for hours, sometimes disappearing for long periods before reappearing suddenly from unexpected directions. But I could tell that the pilot was becoming frustrated with our ability to evade capture by using terrain features that made aerial hunting difficult. Eventually, the helicopter withdrew, and we could hear the sounds of snowmobiles and all-terrain vehicles approaching from multiple directions. The hunters were switching to ground pursuit, which meant they were confident in their ability to track us through the snow. But it also meant they were now vulnerable to the same tactics they had been using against their victims. I found the mining camp just before dark, a collection of abandoned buildings and equipment that had been left to decay for decades. Most importantly, I found a cache of mining explosives that were still stable despite their age. While Sarah kept watch, I rigged improvised traps using the mining explosives and timer mechanisms salvaged from old equipment. I had learned basic demolition techniques during my military service, and I knew enough about wilderness survival to create effective ambush positions. The hunters arrived just after midnight, approaching the mining camp with military precision and professional equipment. But they were expecting to hunt terrified victims, not someone who was prepared to fight back with lethal force. The first explosion took out 2 snowmobiles and their riders as they entered the camp. The second explosion collapsed the entrance to the main building, trapping 3 more hunters inside. The remaining hunters retreated to regroup, but I had already moved to a secondary position with additional improvised weapons. Over the next 6 hours, I systematically eliminated the hunting party using tactics they had never expected from their prey. These were men who were used to hunting helpless victims, not someone who understood military strategy and wilderness warfare. By dawn, only 1 hunter remained alive, and I was able to capture him and extract information about the organization that had been operating in Alaska for 4 decades. What he told me confirmed my worst fears about the scope and scale of the human hunting network. The organization included law enforcement officials, politicians, and wealthy individuals from across the United States and several foreign countries. They operated hunting preserves in remote areas throughout North America, using private aircraft and secure communications to coordinate their activities. Robert Hansen had been one of their most successful hunters, but he was far from the only one. When he was originally arrested in 1983, the organization had orchestrated his fake death and continued operating his hunting grounds using other members and hired contractors. The network was responsible for hundreds of disappearances over the past 40 years, all carefully planned to look like accidents or unsolved missing person cases. They had infiltrated law enforcement agencies to ensure that investigations would be misdirected, and they had connections in government that allowed them to operate with impunity in federal wilderness areas. I forced the captured hunter to radio his headquarters and report that the operation had been successful, buying Sarah and me enough time to reach civilization before anyone realized that their hunting party had been eliminated. But when we finally reached the nearest town and contacted law enforcement, I discovered that the corruption extended further than I had imagined. The first officers who responded to our report seemed more interested in discrediting our story than investigating the evidence we had collected. It took 3 weeks in contact with federal agencies outside Alaska before anyone would take our account seriously. Even then, when investigators finally searched the locations we had identified, they found that most of the evidence had been removed or destroyed. The hunting cabin where I had first discovered the photographs was burned to the ground. The mining camp where the final confrontation had taken place showed signs of extensive cleanup efforts. Even the wreckage of the sabotaged aircraft and snowmobiles had been removed. Sarah and I were placed in protective custody while federal investigators tried to verify our account. But after 6 months, the case was quietly closed due to lack of evidence. We were told that our story could not be corroborated and that continuing to discuss it publicly could result in defamation charges. But I know what we experienced was real, and I know that the human hunting network is still operating somewhere in the Alaska wilderness. Sarah and I were allowed to survive because killing us would have created too much attention after our disappearance had already been reported. The organization is still out there, still hunting human prey in remote areas where disappearances can be explained as wilderness accidents. They are still protected by corrupt officials who ensure that investigations never uncover the truth about their activities. If you ever find yourself in Alaska wilderness and you see signs of recent human activity in areas that should be completely uninhabited, to investigate. To try to help anyone you might hear calling for assistance. Just leave the area as quickly and quietly as possible. Because some of the most dangerous predators in Alaska hunt for food or territory. They hunt for sport, and they've been doing it for longer than most people realize. Robert Hansen may be dead, but his hunting grounds are still active. And they're always looking for new prey. Story 10. Whispering mummies of the museum. I heard them whisper my name 3 times before I understood that the ancient Alaskan mummies in our museum weren't as dead as everyone believed. And what they told me about my future made me realize some knowledge is too terrible to possess. My name is Tom Hartley, and until 6 weeks ago, I worked as the night security supervisor at the Anchorage Museum of History and Ethnology. I had been patrolling those halls for 12 years, walking the same routes through exhibits dedicated to Alaska Native culture, gold rush artifacts, and natural history displays that documented thousands of years of human presence in the far north. The museum's most prized collection occupied the entire 3rd floor. 17 naturally preserved mummies discovered in permafrost caves throughout central Alaska between 1932 and 1994. These weren't Egyptian mummies created through artificial preservation. These were bodies that had been frozen solid for centuries, preserved so perfectly by the extreme cold that their skin, hair, and even facial expressions remained intact. The oldest specimen dated back nearly 800 years, a young Athabaskan woman who had been discovered in a glacier cave near Denali. She was displayed in a climate-controlled case that maintained the exact temperature and humidity conditions necessary to prevent decomposition. Her eyes were still open, staring upward with an expression that seemed almost peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep in the snow. But it was the newest addition to the collection that started the problems. 3 months ago, archaeologists had discovered another perfectly preserved body in a melting permafrost site near Fairbanks. This one was different from the others. He was a shaman, identifiable by the intricate tattoos covering his face and the collection of carved bone artifacts found with his remains. The carbon dating results showed that he had died approximately 400 years ago, but there was something unusual about his preservation. Unlike the other mummies, whose bodies showed signs of gradual freezing, this shaman appeared to have been flash-frozen almost instantly, as if he had been caught in the middle of some kind of ritual or ceremony. The museum director was thrilled to add such a significant specimen to the collection, but the installation crew that moved the display case to the 3rd floor reported strange occurrences during the setup process. Tools went missing, equipment malfunctioned without explanation, and several workers claimed to feel sudden drops in temperature that lasted only seconds before returning to normal. I didn't pay much attention to their complaints at the time. Museums are old buildings with quirky heating systems, and construction projects always involve stressed workers looking for explanations when things go wrong. But within a week of the shaman's arrival, I started noticing changes in the museum's atmosphere during my nightly rounds. The 3rd floor, which had always been the quietest part of the building, began producing sounds that I couldn't identify or locate. Soft clicking noises that seemed to come from inside the display cases themselves. Whispered conversations in a language I didn't recognize, always just quiet enough that I couldn't be sure I was actually hearing them. At first, I blamed the building's aging ventilation system. Old ductwork can create all kinds of strange acoustics, and I convinced myself that what I was hearing was just air moving through pipes and vents. But the sounds were too rhythmic, too purposeful to be random mechanical noise. Then I started noticing the temperature changes the installation crew had mentioned. Walking through the mummy exhibit, I would suddenly encounter pockets of air so cold that my breath became visible, even though the climate control system maintained a constant 72 degrees throughout the building. These cold spots weren't fixed in one location. They seemed to move, following me as I made my rounds. The whispers became clearer after 2 weeks. I could distinguish individual voices, though I still couldn't understand the words they were speaking. But the rhythm and cadence sounded like conversation, as if multiple people were discussing something important in hushed tones. One night, I decided to investigate more systematically. I brought a digital audio recorder and a thermometer with me on my rounds, documenting the temperature variations and trying to capture the whispered conversations. What I discovered changed my understanding of what was happening in that museum. The audio recordings revealed that the whispers weren't random sounds created by air circulation. They were actual voices speaking in what linguistics experts later identified as a dialect of Gwitch, an Athabascan language still spoken by some Alaska Native communities. But the dialect was archaic, using vocabulary and pronunciation patterns that hadn't been heard for centuries. The temperature readings showed that the cold spots weren't caused by malfunctioning heating systems. They were localized areas of extreme cold that defied physical explanation, sometimes dropping 40 degrees within a space of just a few square feet while the surrounding air remained at normal room temperature. But the most disturbing discovery was that the whispers were responding to my presence. When I spoke aloud, asking questions about what was happening, the conversations would stop for several seconds before resuming with increased intensity. The voices seemed to be aware that I was listening and were actively trying to communicate with me. I contacted Dr. Sarah Blackhorse, a linguistics professor at the University of Alaska who specialized in endangered native languages. She agreed to review my audio recordings and provide translations of any conversations I had captured. What she told me 3 days later made me understand that I had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a typical haunting. The voices belonged to the mummies themselves. They were having conversations about current events, discussing people and places in modern Anchorage as if they had been observing the city and its inhabitants for years. They talked about museum visitors by name, describing their personal lives and private conversations in detail that suggested they had been watching and listening to everything that happened in the building. But more disturbing was their discussion of future events. They spoke about things that would happen to specific people, including museum staff members, with precise accuracy. Dr. Blackhorse's translation included references to a car accident that would involve the museum's education director, a divorce that would affect the head curator, and a medical diagnosis that would be given to the maintenance supervisor. All of these predictions came true within the following week. The mummies weren't just preserved bodies on display. They were conscious entities that had retained their awareness and their spiritual power despite being dead for centuries. And they were using that power to observe and influence events in the modern world. Dr. Blackhorse explained that traditional Gwitch in culture included beliefs about shamans who could separate their consciousness from their physical bodies, traveling in spirit form to gather information and affect change in distant locations. According to these beliefs, death didn't necessarily end a shaman's ability to practice their spiritual arts. The newest mummy, the one that had been discovered near Fairbanks, was apparently a shaman of extraordinary power who had found a way to maintain his consciousness and abilities even in his frozen state. Worse, he seemed to be teaching the other mummies how to do the same thing. The whispered conversations Dr. Blackhorse translated revealed that the mummies were planning something. They spoke about reclaiming their homeland, about removing the people who had desecrated their burial sites and put their bodies on display for tourists to gawk at. They talked about awakening other preserved shamans scattered throughout Alaska, museums and research facilities. And they mentioned me by name, describing me as someone who would help them achieve their goals whether I wanted to or not. That is when the dream started. Every night when I went to sleep, I found myself standing in the museum, this third-floor exhibit hall, surrounded by the mummies who had somehow left their display cases and were moving freely through the building. But these weren't shambling zombie-like creatures. They moved with fluid grace, their preserved faces animated with intelligence and purpose. In the dreams, they spoke to me in perfect English, explaining that they had chosen me to be their agent in the living world. They needed someone with access to the building, someone who understood the museum, its security systems, and could help them contact other preserved shamans in museums throughout North America. They showed me visions of ancient Alaska, of thriving native communities that had existed for thousands of years before European contact. They explained that they were the guardians of traditional knowledge and spiritual power that was being lost as modern culture erased indigenous ways of life. But they also showed me what would happen if I refused to cooperate. I saw myself dying in increasingly horrible ways, my spirit trapped in the same state of conscious preservation that bound them to their ancient bodies. They made it clear that death wouldn't be an escape from their demands. The dreams became more vivid and detailed each night. I began waking up with information I hadn't possessed before going to sleep, detailed knowledge about traditional ceremonies, historical events that weren't recorded in any books, and most disturbingly, current addresses and personal information about people I had never met. The mummies were downloading their memories directly into my mind, transforming me into a repository for centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience. But human brains aren't designed to hold that much information, and the process was causing severe psychological strain. I started experiencing blackouts during which I would find myself in locations with no memory of how I had gotten there. Security cameras at the museum showed me entering the building during my nights off, walking directly to the third-floor exhibit, and standing motionless in front of the mummy displays for hours at a time. During one of these blackout episodes, I apparently removed several artifacts from the shaman's display case, including a carved bone knife and a pouch containing what appeared to be dried herbs and animal bones. I had no memory of taking these items, but I found them in my apartment the next morning, arranged on my kitchen table in patterns that resembled traditional ceremonial layouts. The artifacts seemed to amplify my connection to the mummies. With them in my possession, I could hear their whispers even when I was miles away from the museum. They guided me to locations throughout Anchorage where other preserved remains had been discovered over the years, most of which had been moved to private collections or stored in university research facilities. At each location, I found myself performing rituals I had never learned, using the shaman's artifacts to awaken the consciousness of mummified remains that had been dormant for decades. With each awakening, the network of ancient spirits grew stronger and more coordinated. But I also began to understand the true scope of their plans. They weren't just trying to reclaim their burial sites or preserve traditional culture. They were planning to reverse the entire process of European colonization, using their spiritual power to drive modern populations out of Alaska and restore the land to its pre-contact state. The whispers revealed that they had been waiting for the right conditions to begin their campaign. Climate change was melting the permafrost that had kept thousands of preserved shamans dormant throughout Alaska. As their bodies thawed, their spirits were reawakening with centuries of accumulated anger and resentment toward the people who had displaced their descendants. They spoke of plans to cause natural disasters, to influence wildlife behavior in ways that would make human habitation impossible, and to spread diseases that would affect only non-native populations. They had the knowledge and power to make Alaska uninhabitable for anyone who didn't share their bloodline and cultural heritage. And they made it clear that I was expected to help them coordinate these activities using modern technology and infrastructure that they couldn't access directly. 6 weeks ago, I made the decision that ended my employment at the museum and forced me to leave Alaska entirely. During one of my blackout episodes, I apparently used gasoline and road flares to destroy the entire third-floor exhibit hall, including all 17 mummy displays and the artifacts they contained. The fire department was able to contain the blaze before it spread to other parts of the building, but the damage to the mummy collection was total. The preserved bodies that had survived for centuries were reduced to ash and charred bone fragments within minutes. I was arrested for arson and destruction of cultural artifacts, but the charges were eventually dropped when psychological evaluation revealed that I was suffering from severe mental illness caused by prolonged exposure to toxic substances. The official investigation concluded that chemicals used in the preservation process had caused hallucinations and psychotic episodes that made me believe the mummies were communicating with me. But I know the truth about what happened that night. In my final moments of lucidity, I realized that the mummies hadn't chosen me to help them achieve their goals. They had chosen me to be their first victim, a test case to see if they could completely control a living human being. The fire I set wasn't an act of mental illness. It was the only way I could break free from their influence and prevent them from using me to awaken the hundreds of other preserved shamans scattered throughout Alaska, museums and research facilities. The whispers stopped after the fire, but the knowledge they had downloaded into my mind remained. I still know things I should never have learned, remember events I never witnessed, and understand secrets about Alaska, this history that were meant to stay buried in the permafrost. I moved to Arizona 6 weeks ago, as far from Alaska, this frozen ground as I could get. But sometimes, late at night when the desert air is still and cold, I can hear whispers carried on the wind. Voices speaking in ancient languages, discussing plans that span centuries, calling my name with the promise of power and the threat of eternal servitude. Climate change is still melting the permafrost. Archaeologists are still discovering preserved remains throughout Alaska. And museums are still putting these bodies on display, never suspecting that some things are too dangerous to preserve. If you ever visit a museum that displays ancient mummies, pay attention to the temperature around the exhibit cases. Listen carefully for sounds that don't belong in a modern building. And if you hear whispers in languages you don't understand, leave immediately. Because some guardians of ancient knowledge don't want to be remembered. They want to return. And they're still looking for people willing to help them reclaim what they believe was stolen from them. The museum in Anchorage has rebuilt its third-floor exhibit hall, and they've already begun acquiring new specimens to replace the ones destroyed in the fire. But they heard from former colleagues that the new displays are experiencing the same temperature anomalies and unexplained sounds that plagued the original collection. The whispers have returned, and this time, they're choosing their agents more carefully.